For 200 years humanity had endured, and they had taken their place among the Galactic Council not as conquerors, but as diplomats. While other species boasted of their military might and territorial expansion, humans offered trade agreements and cultural exchanges, and they smiled through insults and nodded through condescension, and built bridges where others built walls, because that was what Ambassador Helen Price had taught them all those years ago when Earth first joined the Council. Captain Daniel Hayes commanded the Earth vessel Horizon's Edge, and it was a diplomatic frigate that had spent the last decade ferrying ambassadors between star systems, and his crew was small but dedicated, with Lieutenant Sophie Morrison handling communications and engineer Kyle Barrett keeping the aging ship running, and medical officer Lisa Green tending to both human and alien guests alike, and they were good at their jobs because they had learned patience just like every other human in space. The Galactic Council consisted of 12 major species, and each one believed themselves superior to the newcomers from Earth in their own special way. And the Xanthari were reptilian warriors who controlled 40 systems, and they saw humans as weak because humans rarely fought back when insulted. And the Velcrin were cybernetically enhanced traders who viewed humans as naive, because humans actually kept their promises in business deals. And the Kartesh were ancient scholars who considered humans primitive children playing at diplomacy, because human civilization was only a few thousand years old, while theirs spanned hundreds of thousands of years. Ambassador Helen Price had represented Earth on the Council for 15 years, and she had weathered countless insults with grace, and turned threats into negotiations, and transformed enemies into reluctant allies, and her patience was legendary among both humans and aliens, and her composure was unshakable, even when the Xanthari counselor called humans barely evolved apes, or when the Velcrin suggested that human technology was like watching children play with dangerous toys, and she taught every human diplomat the same lesson, which was that they were the newcomers here, and they must prove themselves worthy through restraint and not aggression, because that was the only way Earth would survive in a galaxy full of older and more powerful species. But patience, like all things, has its limits, and no one knew that better than Commander Jake Phillips, who oversaw the colony world of New Terra, and it was humanity's third extrasolar settlement, and the planet was home to 50,000 humans, who were farmers and scientists building a new life under alien stars, and it was also located uncomfortably close to Xanthari space, which was a fact that had caused tension since the colony's founding 3 years ago, because the Xanthari believed that any world near their territory should belong to them by right of proximity. Jake commanded the colony's small defense force, which consisted of 12 patrol ships and a handful of orbital platforms. And it wasn't much compared to what the major species fielded, but it was enough to protect against pirates and assist civilian vessels in distress, and that was all Earth could afford to station at each colony, because humanity was still building its presence in the galaxy, one small step at a time, while trying not to anger anyone important. When Xanthari warships entered the New Terra system without permission, Jake followed protocol exactly as he had been trained, and he hailed them politely and requested their intentions and reminded them of Council law regarding sovereign space, and he kept his voice calm and professional, even though his heart was pounding because there were 30 Xanthari warships on his sensors, and he had only 12 small patrol craft that wouldn't last 5 minutes in a real fight. The Xanthari commander was Warlord Kreth, and he responded with the contempt that Xanthari always showed to humans, and his message was brief and dismissive, and he said his fleet would conduct military exercises in the system and human concerns were irrelevant, and the strong did as they pleased, and Jake could either accept this or do something foolish and die along with his pathetic little defense force. Jake reported the incident to Earth immediately using the quantum communication relay, and he sent all the sensor data and recordings, and he requested instructions because he knew that making the wrong decision here could start a war that humanity couldn't win. And within 6 hours, Ambassador Price brought the matter before the Galactic Council, and she filed a formal complaint about the violation of New Terra's sovereign space, and she cited treaty agreements and council regulations, and she demanded that the Xanthari withdraw their fleet immediately. The council listened with the same patient condescension they always showed humanity, and the Velcrin representative suggested that humans were overreacting to a simple military exercise, and the Kartesh counseled patience and understanding because the Xanthari had been conducting such exercises for centuries, and it was part of their warrior culture. And the Xanthari counselor, who was Warlord Kreth's own brother, simply smiled and said that perhaps humans should be grateful that the Zenthari fleet was protecting the region from pirates and other threats. Ambassador Price argued for 3 hours, and she presented evidence and legal precedents, and she remained calm and professional throughout. But in the end, the council voted to take no action, and they suggested that Earth and the Zenthari leadership discuss the matter through diplomatic channels, and they moved on to other business as if human concerns were barely worth their time. Back at New Terra, the Zenthari exercises continued, and their warships flew aggressive patterns through the colony's orbital space, and they disrupted shipping lanes and frightened colonists, and twice Zenthari fighters locked weapons on civilian transports just to watch the humans panic and scatter. And each time Jake's defense force could only watch because they were outgunned and outnumbered, and any hostile action on their part would be suicide. The exercises continued for 3 weeks, and every day Jake sent reports to Earth, and every day Ambassador Price brought new complaints before the council, and every day the council did nothing, and the message was clear to every human watching, which was that their lives and their rights mattered less than maintaining the comfort of the older species. And this was the price of being newcomers in a galaxy that had been running smoothly for 300 years without them. Daniel Hayes brought Ambassador Price back to Earth after one particularly frustrating council session, and she sat in the Horizon's Edge observation lounge staring at the stars, and Sophie Morrison brought her coffee and asked if she was all right, and the ambassador said she was fine, but her hands were shaking, and Daniel could see that 15 years of swallowing insults and injustices was taking its toll on her. On the 24th day of the Zenthari exercises, something happened that would change everything, and a Zenthari fighter opened fire on a New Terra medical transport that was carrying patients to the orbital hospital, and the pilot later claimed it was an accident and a weapons malfunction during training, but the transport was destroyed instantly, and 47 humans died, including 12 children who had been traveling to receive treatment for various illnesses and injuries. Jake Phillips watched it happen on his sensors, and he listened to the screams on the emergency channels, and he saw the debris scatter across the black, and he knew in that moment that something fundamental had broken, and he sent every recording and every sensor log and every communication from the past 3 weeks directly to Earth and to every council member simultaneously. And then he added his own message, which was simple and direct, and it said that humans had been patient, and they had followed the council's laws, and they had swallowed their pride and their anger for 200 years, and now their children were dead and no more. The message reached Ambassador Helen Price during a council session, and she was sitting in the human delegation section, listening to the Kartesh representative drone on about trade regulations, when her tablet chimed with an urgent priority signal, and she opened it and watched the recording that Commander Jake Phillips had sent, and she saw the medical transport explode and heard the screams, and read the casualty list with 12 children's names on it, and something inside her that had been holding firm for 15 years finally cracked. She stood up in the middle of the Kartesh speech, and that alone was unprecedented because interrupting a council member was considered deeply disrespectful, and the entire chamber fell silent, and even the Zenthari delegation stopped their usual posturing and whispered conversations, and everyone turned to look at the human ambassador, who had always been so patient and so proper and so careful never to cause offense. Helen walked to the center speaking platform without asking permission, and she connected her tablet to the chamber's display system, and she played Jake's message for the entire council, and the footage of the transport exploding and the screams of the dying in the debris field and the 12 children's names scrolling across the screen, and when it finished she let the silence hang for a long moment before she spoke. Her voice was steady, but everyone in that chamber could hear something new in it, and it was rage, and it was barely controlled fury that made even the Zenthari counselor shift uncomfortably in his seat, because Huma S. had never shown this kind of emotion in council before, and Ambassador Price said that she had served this council for 15 years, and she had counseled patience to her people, and she had told them that civilization required restraint, and that they must earn their place through peaceful means, and every day the council had tested that patience. She said that they had insulted humans and dismissed them and treated them like wayward children who must prove themselves worthy of attention, and she had accepted all of that because she believed that eventually they would see that humans deserved respect and equal treatment under council law, and she had been wrong because the council would never see humans as equals, no matter how patient they were, or how many insults they swallowed, or how carefully they followed every rule and regulation. Today she said the Council had murdered human children, and not in war and not in honest combat, but through negligence and contempt, and the Zenthari had violated New Terra's space for 3 weeks, and filed complaints had been ignored and warnings had been dismissed, and now 47 humans were dead, including 12 children, and the Council would do nothing, just as it had always done nothing when humans were the victims. The Velcrin representative tried to interrupt and offer empty platitudes about investigations and due process, and how the Zenthari pilot had claimed it was an accident, and how these things took time to sort out properly, and Ambassador Price turned to look at him, and the expression on her face made the cybernetically enhanced alien actually step back, because he had never seen a human look at anyone like that before. She said that they had 200 years to treat humans as equals, and that time was over. And she gathered her documents and her tablet, and she walked out of the Council chamber, and behind her the remaining human delegation stood and followed. And within an hour, every human diplomat and representative had left the Council headquarters, and by the end of the day they were all boarding ships back to Earth and human space. Captain Daniel Hayes received new orders 6 hours after Ambassador Price's departure, and the Horizon's Edge was to return to Earth immediately, along with every other human diplomatic vessel, and every ambassador and every delegate and attaché was being recalled. And Sophie Morrison asked what was happening as she monitored the flood of encrypted communications between Earth and the colonies, and Daniel told her quietly that something that should have happened a long time ago was finally happening. Across human space, a transformation was underway, and the stockpiles that humanity had quietly built over 2 centuries were being unsealed, and shipyards that had produced diplomatic frigates were retooling for war production, and research stations that claimed to study peaceful applications of quantum physics revealed their true purpose, which was weapons development, and every human colony activated defense protocols that no alien had ever seen, because humans had been preparing for this possibility since the day they joined the Council. Admiral Christina Wade addressed the defense forces from Earth's Orbital Command Center, and she was 67 years old with gray hair and sharp eyes, and she was a veteran of humanity's first contact incidents, and she had spent 40 years commanding diplomatic escorts and watching her crews swallow insults from species that had never faced a real war. And now she stood before the assembled captains and commanders and told them what was coming. She said that she knew what they were thinking and that they were starting a war they couldn't win, and the Zenthari alone outnumbered them 5-1, and if you added in their allies, the odds were impossible. And she paused and let that sink in before she continued and told them what the Council species didn't know. Every species in the Council had been at peace for 300 years, and they had grown soft, and they treated war like a game and like a sporting contest with rules and honors, and they hadn't fought an enemy that refused to quit and that would use every advantage and every dirty trick and every sacrifice necessary to win. And they had never fought humans who had been pushed too far. The military buildup took 2 months, and humans didn't announce their intentions and didn't issue ultimatums or demands, and they simply stopped attending council sessions and stopped participating in galactic commerce and quietly moved their ships into defensive positions around Earth and every colony. And the Council, accustomed to human compliance, initially dismissed the withdrawal as a tantrum, and the Zenthari were particularly amused. Warlord Kreth sent a mocking message to Earth and offered to accept humanity's surrender when they tired of isolation, and he suggested that perhaps a few decades of being cut off from galactic trade would teach humans their proper place, and he assured them that the Council would welcome them back once they learned humility and respect for their betters. The message was broadcast across the galaxy, and many species laughed at the foolish humans who thought they could survive alone, and the Velcrin calculated how much profit they would lose without human trade and decided it was acceptable, and the Kartesh wrote scholarly papers about the psychological need for young species to assert independence before accepting their place in the natural order. But on Earth, Admiral Wade gathered her officers and showed them something that no alien had ever seen, and it was the complete military history of humanity, and every war, and every battle, and every desperate struggle that humans had fought for, thousands of years before they ever reached the stars. And she told them that while the Council species had been at peace for 300 years, humanity had spent that same time studying war. Commander Jake Phillips worked with local militias on New Terra and trained civilians who had never expected to fight, and engineer Kyle Barrett helped design rapid deployment weapons platforms from civilian mining equipment, and Dr. Lisa Green organized medical teams and prepared for casualties, and none of them wanted this war. But all of them understood that sometimes peace requires the will to fight for it. The council sent a delegation to Earth, and it was led by the Kartesh diplomat who had counseled patience for so long, and they arrived expecting to find humans ready to negotiate and ready to accept apologies and return to their proper place in the galactic order, and instead they found Admiral Wade waiting at the orbital station with a simple message, which was to leave now because the next ship that entered human space without permission would be destroyed. The delegation retreated in shock, and the council convened an emergency session, and they debated what to do about the human problem. And the Zenthari, insulted beyond measure by human audacity, prepared their fleet for war because Warlord Kreth would not tolerate such disrespect from a species that should be grateful the council allowed them to exist at all. The Zenthari came in force, and Warlord Kreth commanded personally, and he led 300 warships toward Earth because it was more than enough to crush any resistance, and the entire galaxy watched expecting humanity's swift defeat and return. To diplomatic submission, and betting pools opened across council space about how long humans would last before they surrendered, and most estimates gave them less than a week. But the fleet never reached Earth, and at the edge of the solar system in the dark between planets where sensors struggled to penetrate humanity, had been preparing, and not defensive stations, as the Zenthari expected, but something far worse, and Captain Daniel Hayes commanded one of 50 human ships lying in wait, and they were small and fast and expendable, and what they lacked in size they made up for in weaponry that no species had seen before. Sophie Morrison reported that the Zenthari fleet was approaching Marker 7, and they were in perfect formation just like the tactical profiles predicted, because the Zenthari loved their formations and their displays of military precision, and Kyle Barrett muttered from engineering that they were showing off and probably sending this back to their homeworld to demonstrate their power, and Daniel allowed himself a cold smile and told Sophie to send the signal to all ships. The trap sprang and 50 human vessels emerged from hiding, but not to engage directly, because that would be suicide, and instead they deployed thousands of autonomous weapons and missiles with adaptive artificial intelligence and minds that could reposition themselves, and drones that learned from each engagement, and every weapon carried something the council species had banned centuries ago, which was nuclear warheads. The Zenthari had forgotten about atomics, and in their civilized galaxy, such crude weapons were considered barbaric and unnecessary when clean energy weapons existed, and they had no radiation shielding and no protocols for dealing with fallout in space combat, because who would be savage enough to use such things? And the answer was humans who had been using nuclear weapons since before they left Earth, and who understood exactly how effective they were. The first detonations tore through the Zenthari formations, and ships that relied on energy shields found them useless against the raw kinetic and thermal force, and the electromagnetic pulses disabled their sophisticated sensors and communications. And in the chaos, human ships darted in and out, targeting command vessels with precision strikes and using tactics that the Zenthari had never encountered, because the council species fought honorable battles with rules and humor as fought to win. Warlord Kreth watched his fleet die, and in 15 minutes he lost 100 ships, and his sensors were half blind from the radiation, and his communications were disrupted, and the human ships vanished before he could mount an effective counterattack, and they left behind radiation fields and debris that made pursuit impossible. And he retreated with what remained of his force stunned and humiliated, because the mighty Zenthari had been bloodied by the weak humans. The entire galaxy watched in shock, and the footage spread across every network and news service, and species that had dismissed humanity as diplomatic weaklings suddenly realized they had made a terrible miscalculation, and the humans had been studying them for 200 years and learning their tactics and finding their weaknesses and preparing for this exact moment. But humanity wasn't done, and strike teams hit Zenthari supply depots in raids that seemed to come from nowhere, and human cyber warfare specialists trained in an era when Earth nations still engaged in digital combat infiltrated Zenthari communications, and sowed confusion and false orders, and sabotage became the norm, and supply ships disappeared and ammunition dumps exploded, and everywhere the Zenthari turned, they found humans waiting with some new horror. The council tried to intervene, and the Velcrin offered mediation and suggested that both sides return to diplomatic talks, and the Kartesh proposed binding arbitration, And Admiral Wade's response was broadcast on every channel, and she said that the Council had 200 years to provide justice and they chose to do nothing. And this was what nothing looked like. Other species began to reconsider their positions, and the Velcrin, calculating profit and loss, quietly withdrew their support from the Zenthari because a prolonged war was bad for business, and the Kartesh, for all their wisdom, recognized that they had pushed humanity too far, and several smaller species that had suffered under Council indifference began to wonder if perhaps humans had the right idea about demanding respect through strength. Commander Jake Phillips defended New Terra with a ferocity that surprised even himself, and he used every dirty trick he had learned from human military history, and the Zenthari, who came expecting an easy target, found mines in orbital space and civilian transports that suddenly revealed hidden weapons and defense platforms that seemed to multiply overnight, because humans had been hiding military equipment inside civilian infrastructure for years. Engineer Kyle Barrett worked 20-hour days converting mining equipment into weapons and retrofitting civilian vessels with military-grade systems, and he barely slept because there was too much work and too much at stake. And Dr. Lisa Green treated wounded defenders and refugees, and she never complained, even when the casualties started coming in, because this was what humans did when pushed, and they worked until they dropped, and then they got back up and worked some more. But the Zenthari, proud and stubborn, refused to back down, and Warlord Kreth rallied his remaining forces and called upon his allies and issued a declaration that if humanity wanted war, he would give them total war, and he would burn every human colony and reduce Earth itself to ash and show the galaxy what happened to species that defied the strong. What he didn't realize was that humans had been preparing for total war since before they reached the stars, and every human colony had underground shelters that could withstand orbital bombardment, and every civilian had basic combat training, because Earth had required it before anyone could emigrate to the colonies, and every ship could be converted to military use in hours, because humans had designed them that way from the beginning. Earth's history was written in blood and sacrifice, and humanity had survived ice ages and plagues and world wars and nuclear standoffs, and they had faced extinction a dozen times and clawed their way back each time, and the Zenthari were about to learn what 200 years of suppressed anger could accomplish when directed by a species that had spent millennia perfecting the art of war. Captain Daniel Hayes received orders to join the defense fleet forming at New Terra, and the Horizon's Edge was retrofitted with weapons that had been stored in hidden compartments, and Sophie Morrison trained on weapon systems she had never expected to use, and Kyle Barrett pushed the engines beyond their rated limits, and Lisa Green prepared sickbay for combat casualties, and they were ready. Admiral Wade sent a message to all human forces, and she told them that the Zenthari were coming with everything they had, and this would be the decisive battle, and if they won here, the war would end, and if they lost everything humanity had built in the stars would be destroyed, and she said she had faith in them, because humans had never known when to quit, and that was their greatest strength. The Zenthari fleet assembled, and it was larger than before because Warlord Kreth had called in every favor and every alliance, and he commanded 500 warships, and he was determined to crush humanity once and for all, and he broadcasted his intentions across the galaxy because he wanted every species to see what happened to those who defied the Zenthari. And he set course for New Terra, where this war had begun, and where he intended to end it in fire and blood. But at New Terra, Commander Jake Phillips smiled grimly as he watched the enemy fleet approach, because he had spent 8 months preparing for this moment, and the Zenthari were about to learn that humans were very good at turning defensive battles into traps. The Zenthari fleet arrived at New Terra with all the confidence of predators who had never known defeat, and Warlord Kreth positioned his 500 warships in a massive formation that blotted out the stars, and he sent a final ultimatum to Commander Jake Phillips, demanding immediate surrender and promising mercy if humans yielded within the hour. And Jake's response was simple, and it was a single word, which was no. The battle began with the Zenthari advancing in their traditional formation, expecting the human defense force to either flee or die quickly, and instead they found nothing but empty space where human ships should have been. And for a moment Kreth thought the humans had already run, and then the orbital platforms opened fire, and they weren't where the Zenthari sensors said they should be, because humans had moved them during the night using low-power thrusters that were almost invisible to detection. The platforms fired missiles that split into dozens of smaller warheads, and each warhead had its own guidance system, and the Zenthari point defense systems were overwhelmed trying to track so many targets, and ships began taking hits, and Kreth ordered his fleet to destroy the platforms, but when his ships moved forward, they entered a kill zone that Jake had spent months preparing. The gravity well of New Terra, combined with carefully calculated orbital mechanics, meant that ships in certain positions had limited maneuverability, and Jake had mapped every meter of that zone and filled it with mines that activated only when Zenthari ships were in the worst possible positions, and the mines didn't just explode, but released clouds of shrapnel that moved in precise patterns calculated to cause maximum damage. Zenthari ships collided with each other trying to evade, and their tight formation became a liability, as disabled vessels crashed into healthy ones, and communications filled with panicked voices and contradictory orders, and through it all, human. Ships struck from unexpected angles and disappeared before the Zenthari could respond effectively. Captain Daniel Hayes led a squadron of 20 ships in hit-and-run attacks against the Zenthari flanks, and they used the planet's atmosphere to hide their approach and came up from below where Zenthari sensors were weakest, and Sophie Morrison coordinated targeting data between ships so that every attack hit a different vessel and prevented the Zenthari from concentrating their defenses. Kyle Barrett had modified the Horizon's Edge engines to produce twice their normal thrust for short bursts, and Daniel used those bursts to close distance fire missiles and retreat before the enemy could lock weapons, and it was dangerous because the engines might explode from the stress, but humans had decided that calculated risks were better than certain death. Dr. Lisa Green worked in sickbay treating wounded crew members from other ships who had managed to dock for emergency medical aid, and she had converted the cargo bay into an auxiliary hospital and trained civilian volunteers to assist because there were too many casualties and not enough trained medics, and she moved between patients with efficiency born of desperate necessity. The battle lasted 6 hours, and it was the longest 6 hours that anyone involved would ever experience, and the Zenthari lost ship after ship to human tactics that seemed to come from nowhere, and Warlord Kreth realized too late that he was fighting an enemy that had studied war for thousands of years while the Zenthari had only practiced it as a form of ritual combat between honorable opponents. Humans didn't fight with honor, and they fought with mathematics and physics and psychology and every advantage they could create or steal or improvise, and they targeted command ships to create chaos and supply ships to limit endurance and communication, relays to prevent coordination, and they did it all with a cold efficiency that terrified species who thought war was supposed to be glorious. Jake Phillips watched the battle from New Terra's command center, and he moved his forces like pieces on a chessboard, and he had learned from humanity's greatest military minds throughout history, and he used ever a lesson from every war Earth had ever fought, and the Zenthari had no counter for tactics developed over millennia of human conflict. A civilian transport piloted by a volunteer named Peter Grant requested permission to ram a Zenthari flagship, and Jake denied the request twice, but Peter insisted that his transport was damaged beyond repair, and his engines were failing, and he was going to die anyway, and he might as well take some of the enemy with him, and Jake finally gave permission, with a heavy heart. Peter accelerated his transport to relativistic speed using every bit of power his failing engines could produce, and he aimed for Warlord Kreth's flagship, and he broadcast a simple message before impact, which was for the 47 and the transport. Hit the flagship at a significant fraction of light speed, and the kinetic energy was equivalent to a nuclear weapon, and the flagship simply ceased to exist, along with Peter Grant and 600 Zenthari warriors. The death of Warlord Kreth broke the Zenthari formation completely, and ships began to retreat without orders, and the retreat became a rout as human forces pressed their advantage and destroyed fleeing vessels that had turned their backs and exposed their engines, and by the time the surviving Zenthari ships reached the edge of the system, they had lost 300 vessels out of 500. Admiral Wade watched the battle data from Earth, and she knew that this victory had cost humanity dearly, and 30 human ships were destroyed, and hundreds of personnel were dead, and thousands more were wounded, but they had won, and the Zenthari fleet was broken, and the war was effectively over because no species would support the Zenthari, now that humans had proven they could defend themselves. The new Zenthari leadership emerged from the chaos of Kreth's death, and they were officers who had opposed the war from the beginning, but had been silenced by Kreth's pride, and now they sent a message to Earth requesting peace talks and offering to negotiate on human terms, And Admiral Wade agreed, but she specified that the negotiations would take place on New Terra on ground stained by human blood. Ambassador Helen Price returned from Earth to lead the talks, and she was different now and harder. And the patience that had defined her for 15 years was gone. But she was still capable of the diplomacy that had served humanity for so long. And this time, however, she negotiated from strength and not from a position of weakness or desperation. The Zenthari delegation arrived at New Terra, and they saw the debris field in orbit and the memorial to the 47 civilians who had died in the medical transport, and the statue of Peter Grant, who had sacrificed himself to kill Warlord Kreth, and they understood that they had awakened something in humanity that would never sleep again. Captain Daniel Hayes attended the peace conference as a military observer, and he stood in his dress uniform with medals he never wanted, and watched Ambassador Price negotiate terms that would have been unthinkable a year ago, and the Zenthari agreed to everything because they had no choice, and their fleet was shattered, and their economy was in ruins, and their pride was broken. Sophie Morrison recorded the proceedings for the historical archives, and Kyle Barrett received a commendation for his engine modifications that had saved countless lives, and Dr. Lisa Green was nominated for the Council's highest civilian honor for her medical work during the battle, and they all knew that nothing would ever be the same again. The treaty was signed in a ceremony broadcast across the galaxy, and the Zenthari agreed to pay reparations for the murdered civilians, and they recognized human sovereignty absolutely, and they sponsored humanity's elevation to a permanent council seat with full voting rights and veto power, and every species watching understood that the balance of power had shifted. The war had lasted 8 months, and in that time humanity demonstrated why they had been such perfect diplomats for 200 years, and it was because they understood their enemies completely, and every weakness and every tactical doctrine and every psychological pressure point had been catalogued and studied during 2 centuries of patient observation, and now the galaxy knew that human patience had never been weakness, but rather preparation. Ambassador Helen Price took her seat at the Galactic Council table, and it was no longer at the periphery where newcomers traditionally sat, but at the center among the founding members, and the other species watched her with cautious respect, because they had seen what happened when humans were pushed too far, and none of them wanted to repeat the Zenthari's mistake. The council chamber was the same building with the same architecture and the same seats, but the atmosphere had transformed completely, and where once there had been condescension, now there was careful attention, and where once there had been dismissal, now there was genuine consideration of human proposals and opinions, and it had taken a war to achieve what 200 years of diplomacy could not. Captain Daniel Hayes received new orders, and the Horizon's Edge would continue its mission as a diplomatic vessel, but now it was armed with weapons that had proven their worth in combat, and his crew was trained for both negotiation and war, and every species they encountered understood that humans preferred to talk, but were no longer asking for permission to be heard. The galaxy learned quickly that the balance of power had shifted, and smaller species that had suffered under the dominance of larger ones began to request human mediation in their disputes, and human peacekeeping forces were deployed to border regions where tensions threatened to explode, and humanity became known as the species that maintained order, not through oppression, but through the credible threat of overwhelming force. Commander Jake Phillips was promoted to admiral and given command of New Terra's expanding defense forces, and the colony that had been a flashpoint for war became a symbol of human resilience and determination, and settlers arrived in increasing numbers because they knew that humanity would defend its own no matter the cost. The memorial to the 47 civilians stood in the center of New Terra's capital city, and every year on the anniversary of their deaths, their names were read aloud in ceremonies attended by thousands, and the names of Peter Grant and the other defenders who had died in the battle were inscribed on walls of remembrance, and humanity never forgot the price of their new status in the galaxy. Engineer Kyle Barrett pioneered new ship designs that combined diplomatic and military functions, and his innovations were copied by other species who recognized that the era of pure civilian vessels operating in deep space was over, and every ship needed to be capable of defending itself because the galaxy was not as peaceful as the Council had pretended. Dr. Lisa Green established medical protocols that became standard across Council space, and she trained alien physicians in human trauma care techniques, and in return learned alien medical practices, and the exchange of knowledge benefited every species and saved countless lives in conflicts that erupted in the years following the HFY War. Sophie Morrison wrote a history of the war that became required reading in every human school and military academy, and her account was brutally honest about both human achievements and human mistakes, and it emphasized that war should always be the last resort, but that sometimes patience and diplomacy were not enough when facing species that respected only strength. The HFY rebuilt slowly, and their new leadership was more pragmatic and less prideful, and they became unlikely allies of humanity, because they understood humans in a way that other species did not, and they knew that humans kept their promises, and honored their agreements and would fight with terrifying effectiveness if provoked, but preferred peace when possible. The Velcrin discovered that trading with humans was more profitable than they had anticipated, because humans were creative and innovative, and developed new technologies at a pace that amazed species who had been stagnant for centuries, and the Velcrin became enthusiastic supporters of human membership in the Council, because good business was good business. The Kartesh scholars studied humanity with new interest, and they wrote extensively about the human capacity for both extreme patience and extreme violence, and how humans could shift between these states with remarkable speed, and they concluded that humanity's contradictions made them uniquely suited to maintaining peace in a galaxy that was more volatile than anyone had admitted. Admiral Christina Wade retired after the war, and she spent her remaining years teaching at Earth's Naval Academy, and every officer who graduated heard her lecture about the importance of preparing for war while hoping for peace, and about understanding your enemies better than they understand themselves, and about never underestimating a species just because they seem peaceful. Captain Daniel Hayes continued ferrying diplomats across the stars, and he saw the changes that humanity had brought to the galaxy, and species that had been oppressed found their voices, and conflicts that had simmered for decades were resolved through mediation instead of violence, and the Council became more just and more equitable because humans refused to tolerate the same injustices they had suffered. New human colonies were established across the galaxy, and each one was fortified and defended, because humanity had learned that survival required both the will to fight and the capability to win, and every colonist understood that they were part of something larger than themselves and that humanity would never abandon its own again. The 47 names were spoken in schools and military academies and government chambers, and they became a reminder of why humanity had finally said no, and why patience without strength was merely weakness, and why sometimes the only way to achieve lasting peace was to demonstrate convincingly that war would be too costly for those who started it. Ambassador Helen Price served another decade on the Council, and she negotiated treaties and resolved disputes and built alliances, and she did it all with the same skill she had shown before the war, but now backed by the knowledge that humanity would support her with force if necessary, and that made all the difference in how seriously other species took human concerns. The galaxy entered a new era, and historians would later mark the HFY War as the turning point when humanity stopped being newcomers and became full partners in galactic civilization, and the Council itself was reformed to give all species equal voice regardless of age or power, because humans had proven that even young species deserved respect and representation. Captain Daniel Hayes stood on the bridge of the horizon's edge decades after the war, and watched the stars slip by, and he thought about how much had changed and how humanity had transformed from patient supplicants to respected equals, and he knew that the 47 had not died in vain because their deaths had awakened something in humanity that would never sleep again. The lesson was learned by every species in the galaxy, and it was simple and clear, and it would be remembered for generations to come. And the lesson was this: humans would always prefer to talk, and would always seek peaceful solutions, and would show remarkable patience in the face of adversity. But when that patience finally broke, the cost would be higher than anyone could afford to pay, and it was better to treat humans with respect from the beginning than to learn that lesson through blood and fire. No species would ever forget the moment humanity's patience finally broke, and more importantly, no species ever wanted to see it happen again.